Hi, this is Kevin Trainer. Welcome to my lecture on Chapter 3 of Interaction Design 4th Edition. Chapter 3 is entitled Cognitive Aspects. We're going to be talking about cognitive aspects, not surprisingly. Um, so, we're going to talk about what is cognition, pretty much mind and thinking stuff. What are users good and bad at as it relates to cognition? We're going to describe how cognition has been applied to interaction design in terms of theories and models. We're going to explore this whole idea of mental models, which I think is very, very helpful. Then talk about relevant theories of cognition. So, why do we need to understand our users with respect to their cognition? Well, they are interacting with our technological solution, and that interaction is cognitive, more than physical. And so we need to take into account the cognitive processes involved and some of the cognitive limitations that the users might have, so as best to design the interaction. This is going to provide us with knowledge about what users can and cannot reasonably expected to do. I think we'll all allow for variation in terms of capabilities and sensibilities in users, but there are some general and average rules that we'll be able to take advantage of. We want to be able to identify and explain the nature and causes of problems that users encounter when they're cognitively interacting with our information technology solution. And we want to supply theories, modeling tools, guidance, and methods that can lead to design of better interactive products. Okay? And I just want to say here that this is really in keeping with the theme of the approach we have in this course, is we want to go beyond tips and tricks. Okay? Popular wisdom about good user interfaces is very tips and tricks oriented. And what we're really trying to do is to go down much deeper, take a look at the research that's been done on the cognitive considerations in human-computer interaction, and then talk about what conclusions can be drawn from that. The really good thing about this is as time goes by and the technology changes, as it does pretty rapidly, some of our tips and tricks are going to age. You know, if I were to remember the tips and tricks that I was taught about interaction design when I first got into computing, they would involve things like paper forms for people to code their data onto. They would involve the way to design a green screen. They might involve light pens, things that for the most part are no longer used. So while tips and tricks can age, these more general principles will be more lasting. And that's where the real value comes. So we're going to begin by taking the cognitive processes and dividing them up in a way that's going to help us to go through them. So the cognitive process, according to this taxonomy that we're going to use, attention, perception, memory, learning, reading, speaking, and listening, problem solving, planning, reasoning, and decision making. Okay, and so we're going to separate those out and attack them in due course. So let's talk about attention first. What do we mean by attention? Well, we mean selecting things to concentrate on at a point in time from the mass of stimuli around us. I think we would all agree that we are in a time that is very stimulating. It's particularly stimulating in terms of the amount of information technology enabled stimuli that come to us. And so getting the attention of the user is something that has become a very big issue. So attention allows us to focus on information that's relevant to what we're doing. It involves either audio or visual senses. And I was thinking this morning when I was reviewing the material for the lecture that typically these are audio and visual senses. But for instance, my new smart watch vibrates. Okay? And I was perusing the chapter, and what popped up at about the same time I'm reading this, but my watch buzzed to tell me that I wasn't moving enough. Traditionally audio and visual senses, but even more, physical sensations. Could we perhaps get people's attention with smell? Well, it's not something we typically do, except when we're trying to get people to eat for the most part. But there's a lot of things that are possible. Focused and divided attention enables us to be selective in terms of the mass of competing stimuli, but limits our ability to track all events. So we're in this kind of tension. Okay, on one hand, if we don't let in enough of the stimuli, certain events that we care about will go by without us without them coming to our attention. On the other hand, if we attempt to track everything, perhaps we won't successfully track anything at all. So it's this tension that begins to inform some of the concerns that we have. Okay? So information at the interface should be structured to capture users' attention. It should use perceptual boundaries, things like windows. It should use color, reverse video, sound, and flashing lights. So there are all kinds of things that we can do to call more attention to some particular bit of information so that it stands out in the field of other information. There's a pretty good discussion of the risks of overusing that in the text, where if we're going to highlight everything, well, then we've highlighted nothing, right? If we're going to make everything flash, well, nothing's going to look distinctive. Now, the next couple of screens demonstrate some of the things that we can do to call attention information. This is really physical organization of information. Okay, so This is information from which one could find out the price of a double room at a Holiday Inn in Colombia. Okay. And it's pretty easy to do from this screen. And the same information is on this second screen. And it's much harder to do. And it's much harder to do. Well, actually, this is not the same, but similar information, because this is about Pennsylvania. And I think the other one was about one of the Carolinas. But it's much harder because of the physical organization to find what you want. So when what we're trying to do is to search for something, the proper physical organization of the material is important, and that's not going to surprise us. That is going to be consistent with the tips and tricks we've already learned. So the activity that they suggested for us to look at these two screens, and researchers found that the two screens produce quite different results. The first one took an average of 5.5 seconds to search. The second screen took 3.2 seconds to search. I think we have them in the opposite order here. The fact is, the one with the right physical organization was the one that was easier to search. And yet they have the same physical density. In the screen where the information is all bunched up together, makes it hard to search. Where they are grouped and organized physically, appropriately, it makes it easier to search. So for searching, physical organization of information in the user interface can be a great aid. Not surprising, because it's consistent with our traditional tips and tricks. Multitasking is an issue that comes up a lot. I know it comes up a lot in my house. My wife is more dedicated to multitasking than I am. And of course, sometimes we get into that old saw about perhaps it's easier for women to multitask than men. And I'm not going to express an opinion on that. But there are researchers have done some work on multitasking. And this study in 2009 compared heavy multitaskers to light multitaskers. And they saw that heavy multitaskers were prone to being distracted, more prone to being distracted than those who infrequently multitask. And that light multitaskers did better. So it was kind of interesting. It was this idea that perhaps not all multitasking is the same, and that at a certain point, the people who you see multitasking, it's hard to know what's cause and effect. That's just, kind of my read of the research. Some people are multitasking because they can't stay on task. And other people are multitasking because they really want to share their attention. And so that you really have to ask yourself, are we encouraging an optimal level of multitasking in the user interface that we're creating? So when we think reflectively and we do research on attention as an element of cognition, it's going to have implications for our design, for the interactions in our systems. We want to make information salient when it needs attending to. Okay, so it might not need attending to all the time. So whatever we're going to use to make it salient might not be static; it might be dynamic. We're going to use techniques that make things stand out, like color, ordering, spacing, underlining, sequencing, and animation. We want to avoid cluttering the interface with too much information. Certainly, that's consistent with tips and tricks. And search engines and fill-in forms have the simple and clean. It can have simple and clean interfaces that are easier to use. So I think the takeaway here is that we want to be thoughtful about attention when designing the user interface, because it's pretty important stuff. Now let's move on from attention to perception. When we talk about perception, we mean how information is acquired from the world and transformed into experiences. Um, the obvious implication for this is to design representations of information that are readily perceivable. So our text should be legible, and the icons that we use on our screen should be easy to distinguish and to read. But one of the studies that they talk about in the textbook did a comparison of the effectiveness of this color blocking to separate data as compared to uh, outlining. And the research indicated that people did better with the outlining than they did with the color blocking. I just want to point out that what they've really done here on slide 12 is alternate a color blocking, when most people would say that having half of the blocks just be the background color is not really effectively color blocking them. I would like to see the experiment when, let's say, half of the blocks are light blue and the other half are light pink. I'm not sure that the differences between that kind of color blocking and this kind of outlining, I'm not sure how that would turn out. The outlining might turn out better, or the double color blocking might be better than the outlining. It certainly would be interesting to find out. I think the takeaway here is that some of these things aren't intuitive, okay? And also, some common practices, some common visually appealing practices, like this color blocking, which I think has a nice, makes a nice artistic statement. Some of these are less effective than things that are sort of artistically passe, right? So there's, the outlinings that we're looking on page 3. This isn't sophisticated graphical design, and yet it might be more effective. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for effective. Ideally, we would like to do both. We would like our work to be beautiful, and we would like our products to be usable. So the next area that we're going to talk about here, in fact, we're still talking about perception, but now there was an activity in the chapter, okay? And so they talked about the two things that we just took a look at. So we've already talked about this. Here's a related thing here. We've got a bunch of text. These are things that we could put up on a web page. A combination of a background color or pattern and type that has a particular color. And we're asking which is easiest to read and why. And I've got to say that for me, it'd be interesting what works for you, but what works for me is probably the one in the upper right. Um, and what works for me is just the sheer contrast. Okay, it jumps out. The what is the time jumps out for me there. Probably the second most appealing one is just the black and white one in the lower right. Some of the other ones, like the middle one on the left side, those are all interesting colors, but the contrast doesn't work visually. I lose the text in the background. And whereas, and the one on the the upper left, I have the same thing. So sometimes um, um, information that you think is going to be easily perceived is not perceived as easily as you think. And this is going to really play well into the approach that we're taking in our course because we're not going to rely on simply tips and tricks. We're going to test our interface. And we're going to collect some data and we're going to see if the design ideas that we had to meet the requirements that we identified, we're going to see whether, in fact, they were effective. And if they're not, we're going to get an opportunity to tune them up. So, what are the design implications for the perception aspect of cognition? Well, icons should enable users to readily distinguish their meaning. I One of the things that is kind of interesting here is not in this text, but I've mentioned in some of my other lectures a text by Cooper called About Face, which is, I think, up to the fourth edition. So it's called About Face 4. And they have a really good discussion in that text of whether icons should try to imitate objects in life, you know, or whether they should just be distinctive and perhaps suggestive designs. And Cooper comes out to recommend the latter. He says that some of these things, some of these icons that resemble physical devices, they tend to age. And two examples of these are one, telephone icons. And in the early days of graphical user interfaces, things that had to do with calling or telephone would typically have sort of a picture of a telephone desk handset a la 1970. Okay. Well, that's not what telephones look like today. Likewise, even now in your typical toolbar interface, the icon that we use for saving looks like a diskette. Well, your average young user has never used a diskette. They don't even hardly know what they are. So Cooper recommends that the icons should be distinctive and suggestive, and probably will do better for them to be have those kinds of properties than for them to try to imitate objects in the analog world, which are changing pretty fast. Okay, well, there was an aside for you. Bordering and spacing are effective visual ways of grouping information. That's consistent with our tips and tricks. Sounds should be audible and distinguishable. Speech output should enable users to distinguish between a set of spoken words. text should be legible and distinguishable from the background. We saw that a slide ago. And tactile feedback should allow users to recognize and to distinguish different meanings. Okay, all those things sound very appealing to me. Another aspect of cognition that we want to discuss is memory. Memory involves first encoding the knowledge and then retrieving it. We don't remember everything. It involves filtering and processing what is attended to. And so, of course, there is talk about people who have unusual memories, who can recall basically everything that happened on a given day at a different time. And there even have been a couple of TV shows or movies or novels with this kind of premise. And I guess it's probably true that such people exist. And probably if they are able to sort of encode and record and retrieve much more than the rest of us. The rest of us are really left with the more common problem of having to make sure that we pay attention to what we want to remember, and then having to deal with the issue of remembering it. There's a good discussion in the text about how context is important in affecting the memory. There are times when we can't recognize a person, for instance, because they're in a different context. We might sort of recognize a face, but not be able to put a name with it because we're seeing them we're seeing them at work, and maybe they're part of our church or part of our sports club. Okay, and it just so it's a common experience for people to say, "I know that face, but I can't figure out who that is." So memory appears to have a contextual element to it. We seem to be able to recognize things better than being able to recall things, and we're talking about recalling things, being able to being able to say what their name is and what their relationship is to other things in the world. Okay, so again, we might say, I recognize that person, but I don't know where I know them from. We remember less about objects we have photographed than we have observed them with the naked eye. And I know this is true. I was accused for years of going on to vacation and seeing the whole thing through a camera. And the fact is, when you're taking photos, you're concentrating on that process rather than just experiencing whatever you're experiencing. Okay. I guess the idea is if you do well enough with the photograph that you'll have that to experience it forever, which, of course, is not something everyone would agree with. Memory being such a tricky thing, it's been helpful for researchers and theorists to pose some models of how memory works so that we might understand it better or more effectively. They said that encoding is the first stage of memory. So it determines which information is attended to in the environment and how it is interpreted. The more attention paid to something, the more it is a process in terms of thinking about it and comparing it with other knowledge, the more likely it is to be remembered. And in fact, if you read the books or watch the videos about how to improve your memory, they often involve tricks of taking the information that you are seeing and trying to relate it to things that you already know. So it sort of increases the processing on it, at least in theory, and it tends to give you a couple of more handles to be able to retrieve it by. Context is important. I mentioned that before. Context affects the extent to which information can be subsequently retrieved. Sometimes it can be difficult for people to recall information that was encoded in a different context. So we talked about recognizing a person out of context or in context being two different kinds of tasks. And the activity that we were asked to do in the chapter included things like try to remember the dates of your grandparents' birthday and try to remember the cover of your last two DVDs that you bought or rented and which was easier. And for me, it was the DVDs. And I think it was easier. Well, first of all, they're closer in time. So my grandparents have been deceased. Well, they were all deceased before I was born. So my grandparents' birthdays is historical information, whereas the covers of the last two DVDs that I bought is much more recent. And also, it's much more visual. And one aspect of it that I think is of particular interest to me is that there's a story aspect to it too. The DVDs that I would have bought would have been movie DVDs, and there's a story to each of those, and I can remember the story. I find that people seem to be able to remember stories better than just individual facts. And in fact, I do a lot of work in systems analysis, and it seems to be the preferred methods of systems analysis in the current day are really all have to do with telling the story of how the user is going to use the system to get the job done. And this storytelling aspect to it seems to be a very powerful feature. So people are good at remembering visual cues, and they find it hard to remember arbitrary material. And also things that have a story, I think, have a particular power, although that's not something that they mention in the text. We would like to be able to distinguish between recognition and recall when we're talking about these memory phenomena. Okay, so command-based interfaces require the users to recall from memory the name of all the possible set of hundreds of commands. Okay, I think we said hundreds, but I think we really wanted to say hundreds of commands. Graphical user interfaces, on the other hand, require that we only recognize them as they appear. So if we recognize them, and that's enough for us to act, and then we present some more in the user interface, and then we recognize them, and that's enough to act, it seems to be a lot easier to recognize than to recall. This seems to be why graphical user interfaces have some of the popularity that they have. Okay? At least for beginners and certainly for intermediates. graphical user interfaces seem to be preferred over command line interfaces, which seem to be preferred, if at all, by experts. It seems like the experts are better able to recall the commands, whereas the intermediates and the novices will do best to rely on recognition. We're going to talk here about a rule, a theory that's been kind of codified into a rule that we've heard quite a bit in terms of tips and tricks in user interfaces. And this was a theory developed by George Miller in the 50s of how much information people can remember. And it was said that they can remember 7 things plus or minus 2, so somewhere between 5 and 9. And you'll see people quoting those numbers for a wide range of phenomena. How long a list should be, how many people should be on an agile software development team. It seems to be a very common, comfortable range of items. So, why did he come up with that? Well, people's immediate or short-term memory capacity is very limited. And they did research, typically asking people to remember a sequence of numbers, and they found out that people did best in that kind of range. That they couldn't really get past that. Okay? Now, according to the authors of our text, many designers think that we ought to take that theory and turn that right into probably hardcore tips and tricks, and put it right into interaction design. But, and so, what would people do? Well, we would present only 7 options on a menu. We would display only 7 icons on a toolbar, 7 bullets on a list, 7 items on a pull-down menu, 7 tabs on top of a website page. And our authors are going to say that this is wrong, okay? And why? They think it's an inappropriate application of theory because people can scan lists of bullets, tabs, menu items, for the one they want. They don't have to recall them from memory, having only briefly heard or seen them. Sometimes a small number of items is good, but it depends on the task and the available screen real estate. So, I think it's probably true. I still would think that long lists of things to choose from are less appealing than lists that are short or have an intermediate length. I think that lists can be too short. Would you rather have 10 successive choices of 2 options, or would you rather have 2 successive choices of 5 options? Well, it depends on what the options were, right? But certainly getting the number as small as possible is not the only goal, right? There is some kind of a happy medium. So the takeaway here is that even though our as scientific interaction designers, even though we're learning about a lot of theories, and you could draw conclusions from them about how we want to design the user interface, it's possible to simply misinterpret the theory. And this 5 to 9 theory is probably a good example of that. Let's talk about digital content management. So, digital content management is a growing, I would say, opportunity for many users, not problem. Um, we have a lot of digital content. We have documents, images, music files, etc. Um, we have to figure out where and how to save them all and remembering where they are, um, what they're called, and how to find them again. Naming is the most common means of encoding them, and um, it's probably also one of the most basic. You'll see lots of groups of users come to naming schemes for their files. For instance, when I worked at a research center at the University of Illinois, we had, when I got there, we had a scheme for encoding the names of our document files that, it included their date and a number of other things. And um, um, it was effective for the users because they were used to it, but it probably wasn't very sophisticated digital content management. But it was a way to solve the problem when the only tool was a file name. Um, how might such a process be facilitated taking into account people's memory abilities? Well, you see, that's when we start to take some of the theory and we start to apply it to how we might design the user interface. Okay? Well, first of all, we need to remember that memory involves two processes: recall, recognition. Okay? So if we're going to come up with finding aids, some of them might be recall directed, and some of them might be recognition based. Some of them might be hybrids of the two. Okay? So ideally, for our authors, a file management system should include them both. We have both of those capabilities. We ought to use them both. So we might, for instance, use a search box and a history list. Okay, so a search box would be causing the system to have to recall. No, sorry. Uh, for the user, a history list would be recall, and a search box. Well, it's kind of hard to tell. This is kind of funny because as I think of these things, I think of them as slightly different ways. If we have a history list, then we're looking to recognize the one that we want. We don't have to think about it from one. If we're looking at a list of all the websites that we went to, we don't have to remember it. We can just recall it as we go through the list. And this could also be true to a certain extent of search results. The other thing we can do is that we can provide more ways to encode metadata regarding files than just the file name. Okay, so they've got things like color, flagging, images, flexible text, time stamping, and of course, any kind of a formal metadata scheme might appeal to people with an information science background. Here we have Apple's Spotlight search tool, one that I don't really use it enough as an Apple user. And what's really interesting here is it has some aspects of search. So we'll try to recall a word or term that's going to help us. But then it's going to categorize the hits that we get, and we can switch over into recognition mode. So here's a tool that allows us to use both memory skills with the same tools and in a really powerful kind of a hybrid way. This is an interesting discussion. When you think of memory and user interfaces, you're often trying to solve the problem of remembering, but here's a slide where we're talking about perhaps forgetting. Um, so, when might you wish to forget something that is online? When you break up with a partner, if it's emotionally painful to be reminded of, through shared photos, etc. Now, this is all very personal, but in the days of fake news, okay, we have uh, the same kind of problem. Perhaps we're searching for information. We find our way to an unreliable source. Well, we want to discount that unreliable source in the future. And this is when I say, in a world where we do search, forgetting is not really forgetting. It's maybe remembering. Okay, in a world, uh, we're never going to forget um, that girlfriend or boyfriend that we broke up with, and perhaps we're still feeling upset about. The best opportunity for us is to engineer things so we don't run into them. Okay. Now we probably would like that to not obsess our thinking, right? Okay, so the opportunity for things like unreliable information sources is not to forget them, but to, for instance, be able to flag them, to be able to put people who send us spam on a blacklist, such that we don't get spam, to be able to take friends and put them on a whitelist so that they don't get caught in a spam filter. Okay, so these are the kinds of things that I think are the appropriate kind of behavior that we're looking for in um, digital forgetting. The bullet on the bottom, um, talking about the Sass and Whitaker study, oh, I just think is sort of wrong-headed. So we're not going there. Sorry. Memory aids. There's a pretty good discussion of memory aids in the text that I really like. One product that they talk about, which is called what's called SenseCam from Microsoft Research Labs, and apparently, according to this slide, is now called Autographer. It's a wearable device that intermittently takes photos without any user intervention while worn. The digital images taken are stored and then revisited using special software. It's been found to improve people's memory, people who are suffering from Alzheimer's or other causes of dementia. So this is a great idea. Okay, the idea that with proper prompting and maybe taking recall and shifting it more into recognition, we can get some better results. And this is a picture of the SenseCam, which I think is pretty neat. So what are some of the design implications of the memory things that we've talked about already? We've had a segue or two into design implications with regard to memory, but here now we're going to really jump in. Don't overload users' memories with complicated procedures for carrying out tasks. Design interfaces that promote recognition rather than recall. Provide users with various ways of encoding information to help them remember. You can put things into categories, you can do them by color, you can do them by flagging, you can do them by time stamping. And this, I think, really gets us to the personal of personal computing. People's sensibilities are going to be different with regard to this. So for some people, color coding thing is just what they want. For other people, flagging things is going to be just what they want. So it's probably going to be true that if you're creating some kind of a product in which you want people to help, if you want to help people remember information when it's appropriate, that you might want to provide more than one means of doing that. What are the so let's talk about another a cognitive consideration, which is learning. How to learn a computer-based application. Using a computer-based application or a YouTube video to understand a given topic. People find it hard to learn by following instructions in a manual, and they prefer to learn by doing. So, I think this is really a case where our expectations are going to shift pretty drastically over time. And so looking at researching and thinking about general principles is going to be important because we're going to have more options over time. Historically, we would write user manuals for software or for products of any kind. Certain people like me are not inclined to read them. I pride myself that I only read the manual in cases of electric shock. So if I've been given an electric shock by the device, then I think, well, probably I ought to stop and read the manual. YouTube and videos in general are very popular these days. I know in my teaching, I use a lot of video tutorials that I put onto YouTube. My students seem to like it, and I've come to prefer it as a way to learn things. Particularly when you're trying to learn a product, what I like about it is, first of all, it's very vivid. Okay, it's very rich experience, and also I can control the pace. I like the idea that I'm able to stop and back up and back up and stop and back up. In fact, I find that for my demonstrations that I like to have be part of my teaching, that the demonstrations that I record onto video are more useful to my students than the ones that I do in person, because the ones that I do in person are too fast for some people and they're too slow for others. Now, there are people who speed up the videos, but that's a little extreme. I don't think there's too much that can be done there. But there's a lot to be done, stop and replay. And people who need to see things a couple of more times are going to get that opportunity from that. Okay, and there are all kinds of other ways to help people to learn. Applications that have you practice the task, and will only let you move on till you've been able to demonstrate it. Now, I find these a little frustrating. These are typical things you get when you're getting say training for ethics. This is very big at state universities where I teach. They'll teach you how to make some kind of a decision, and then they'll put you through a simulation, and then you have to show that you know how to do it, or you won't get to go on to the next part of the training. Well, that's a learn by doing in a certain way. Some people like that. Some people find that a little too controlling. Well, here's a great idea: cognitive prosthetic devices. We rely more and more on the internet and smartphones to look things up. Um, and so these are resources that extend our mind, they extend our memory, and they allow us to essentially offload a lot of things. We'll be talking about that more formally in a couple of minutes. Um, One of the nice things is expecting to have internet access reduces the need and the extent to which we have to remember. And I had a good example of this a couple of weeks ago. My family and I went to Washington to the Women's March on Washington, and we expected to participate. And we didn't know how many people to expect. I think they expected maybe 200,000, and they got about 500,000. And our concern was, at what point were our cell phones going to overload such that the access that we had to the parade route and to all of our typical information was going to go away. And what we found was that while we were there, our ability to use our smartphones came and went. It was very good in the beginning of the day. It was pretty good in the very end of the day when the numbers of people had gone down. But when we were at the height of the day, it was very difficult to bring up the map of the marching route because there were just so many users that were trying to use the system. Um, these uh, these devices that we can use to aid the memory, and as we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, not just the memory, but things like computation and decision making, are really powerful. And having having a computer in my pocket that's more powerful than the computer was at my university when I went to college 40 years ago gives us a lot of possibilities that we never dreamed of were possible 40 years ago. Um, what are some of the design implications here? Well, the counting capabilities that we have allow us to design interfaces that encourage exploration. Okay, um, people have more than memory and recognition, recall and recognition. They've got the ability to go explore things, and so we can create application experiences in which through recall and recognition, but also through some kind of whimsy, we can see things in the interfaces that appeal to us, and we can just go explore them. That's probably the general model for web surfing, which has been very, very appealing. Um, we want to design interfaces that constrain and guide learners. Um, the opposite of surfing is, well, the opposite of surfing is being on dry land, said by a former surfer. But there are times when we want the test to be very explorable, and there are times when we don't want the exploration to go in any direction because we know, because of the test that we're doing, that exploration in some directions is not going to be productive. So, constraining and guiding the learners can be as powerful and at the right time and place as the ability to encourage exploration when and where that's appropriate. Um, Dynamically linking concepts and representation can facilitate the learning of complex material. Now, this is, I think, a pretty powerful idea, and this is, um, well, this is really the promise of learning tools based on modern computer-based information systems. I mean, we can get away from things that are only reading based or listening based. They can be much more experiential. So let's talk about stuff like that. Let's talk about reading, speaking, and listening. The ease with which if people can read, listen, or speak differs. Okay, so they differ from individual to individual, and then the relative strength of the skills it can be different within the same individual. So lots of variability here. So many people prefer listening to reading. I know that I've gotten to the point where listening to audiobooks is probably my chief way of experiencing fiction, where there was a time in my life when I thought that was just simply cheating and wasn't at all interested in. Reading can be quicker than speaking or listening, and you only have to go to a speech where they hand out the text ahead of time, and when you're really interested, you get so far ahead of the speaker, you just wish they would shut up. Listening requires less cognitive effort than reading or speaking, and it pretty much gels with my experiences, which is why I like audiobooks so much. I can listen to an audiobook and do a lot of things, certainly all kinds of mechanical work. The classic for me is be doing house painting or something like that and listening to the audiobook at the same time. Could I read and do that at the same time? Well, probably not. Can I speak to somebody and do it at the same time? Well, it depends on what we're speaking about. If we're having a serious conversation, I probably have to stop painting. If we're just shooting the breeze, I can probably keep on painting. People have differing abilities in these things. So people who have what some people call dyslexia have difficulty understanding and recognizing written words. So that for them, their preference for the spoken word over the written word would be significant. So how does this relate to applications that we might get involved in the design of? Well, speech recognition systems allow users to interact with them by asking questions. So Google Voice, Siri, those kinds of things. Speech output systems use artificially generated speech. Okay, and we see, first of all, that becomes the output side of those speech interaction systems like Google Voice or Siri. Not only can you speak to them, but they speak to you, right? And then, of course, we have devices like GPSs, which typically we don't speak to yet, but they speak to us. Written text-to-speech systems for the blind are getting better and better. And then we have natural language systems that enable users to type in questions and give text-based responses. And here they give the example of the Ask search engine. But I'm going to put this on pause and come back with my better example. I'm back, and I'm hoping you can see my browser with a page up for Wolfram Alpha. And Wolfram Alpha describes itself as a computational knowledge engine. and it has a natural language interface, at least on the input side. And so you can ask it questions like, where was Lincoln born? And it says it thinks we're talking about Abraham Lincoln place of birth, Hodgenville, Kentucky, United States. So that looks pretty good. That worked fine. Okay. And then they always have a way of heading off the tricky questions, like how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? And so you ask them that. And, oh, sorry, that's wood, not woo, wood. Okay. And so you ask that. And it says, assuming that we want the tongue twister, and they give you back a tongue twister answer. Woodchuck would chuck all the wood that he could chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood. This capability, I think, Wolfram Alpha with some of the smarts was underneath Siri in the original days. Whether it's there now, I don't know. But it certainly would be there for your application. So there are all kinds of possibilities there. Oddly enough, when I couldn't remember the name of Wolfram Alpha, I put you guys on hold and I went to my smartphone and I found one of the Wolfram Alpha apps that I have that helps me cheat at word games. And I went, yeah, Wolfram Alpha. And that was it. So, memory, absolutely. Okay, so let's move ahead. So what are some of the design implications of stuff we've talked about in the last couple of minutes? Well, speech space menus and instructions should be short, okay? I don't know about you, but I always, as soon as I get into one of those speech menus and they get up past 4 alternatives, I'm really at a loss for what I wanted. So have these things where they say give you 7 alternatives. You can't keep all of them in your mind, or not well. Accentuate the intonation of artificially generated speech voices. They're harder to understand than human voices, so they still could use some improvement. And provide opportunities for making text large on the screen. Again, you ought to be prepared for different users having different sensibilities. Okay, so that's something we're to be thinking about while we're designing all the time. Okay, so let's talk about some more cognition-related stuff. Problem solving, planning, reasoning, and decision making. So all of these involve reflective cognition. For example, thinking about what to do, what the options are, and what the consequences might be. They often involve conscious processes, discussion with others or oneself. Discussion with oneself is always a favorite for me, and the use of artifacts. And by artifacts, we mean maps, book, pen, paper, etc. They may involve working through different scenarios and deciding which is the best option. Okay, so this is a pretty rich and challenging environment when we're trying to do these things. So what are the design implication for information systems that support these activities? Well, we might want to provide additional information or functions for users who wish to understand more about how to carry out an activity more effectively. And we ought to, maybe for some people, because people's sensibilities are different, we ought to provide the opportunity to get less information as well. And we can use simple computational aids to support rapid decision making and planning for users on the move. Now, we're going to come into an area of discussion that is, I think, a little controversial. Uh, Here's a claim. Gardner and Davis, in their work in 2013, they made the claim that the app mentality developing in the psyche of the younger generation is making it worse for them to make their own decisions because they are becoming risk averse. Okay? Relying on a multitude of apps on their smartphones means that they're becoming increasingly more anxious about making decisions by themselves. Do you agree? Can you think of an example? Well, I'll give you time to think about it. And of course, when you read the chapter, I'm sure you thought about it. But I don't really agree. I mean, I deal with a lot of young people in my day. My typical day is I'm dealing with people from age 18 to age 60, maybe, something like that. And I'm finding that the number of people who are sort of app obsessive, um, I see more older people who are more obsessed with apps than younger people. So I don't think that the younger generation is got a particular problem here. I do think that we have some funny behavior. I know that when my wife and I are thinking about going for a hike, because we both work at home some days, and so about maybe 4:30 in the afternoon, we'll think about a hike, depending upon what time of year it is. And of course, we want to know what the weather is. Well, we're inclined to look at our watch. We have smart watches, we have smartphones, we have all those things. But of course, um, sometimes we'll laugh at ourselves because we just have to walk out the front door. So, what's the best way to find out what the weather is outside right now? Well, go outside. So I think this is a straw man. I think that no, there probably are some things that we become maybe too dependent upon. But where there are all kinds of things like the weather, the time, the news, all kinds of things, you see people checking their devices for all the time. That if they don't have their devices, they just do something else. They just walk out the front door, or they ask the guy at the gas station, "Who's ahead in the Cubs game?" Things that we did for years and years. So I doubt that this is the problem that some people might think it could turn out to be. And certainly, I don't see any real distinctions between or trends between younger people and older people. We're going to talk a bit about mental models. Okay. Um, Earlier, a couple of chapters ago, we were talking about the importance of our system having a conceptual model. Okay. And now we're going to talk about what the user has in their head as a mental model of the system, how it works. And one of the things that we're going to be interested in is the amount of fidelity between those two. Okay, if they're the same, that can be very powerful. If they're different, it can be very frustrating. Okay, so users, as they learn about and they come to use our system, they develop an understanding of it. Sometimes we describe this as a mental model of the system, how to use it, what to do next. what to do with unfamiliar systems or unexpected situations. So when we come to something new, we typically have some idea, well, normally I'd look to click something here, and we look around to click something. So people make inferences using these mental models that they construct over time about our system on how to carry out the tasks. Now, a lot of research has been done about mental models. So Craig, way back in 1943, described a mental model as internal constructions of some aspect of the external world enabling predictions to be made. Most theorists in this area would say that involves both unconscious and conscious processes. Images and analogies are activated. Often you'll hear people distinguish between deep and shallow models. Okay, so for instance, your mental model of a car doesn't have to be that deep in order to be a driver. Well, I mean, you have to know a lot. Certainly, you have to know a lot more to be a driver than a passenger, right? But your mental model of a car has to be much more deep and complex if you're going to be a mechanic who fixes cars. Okay, so maybe depends on the role that you're playing, how deep and robust your mental model has to be. So if people get wrong-headed mental models of information systems all the time. Okay, the example here on slide number 43 are if people will get wrong how to use the thermostat, and both examples here, we have a thermostat for a home, a room, and the other one is we have the temperature that you set on the oven, which is also thermostat based. So the question is, if you're in a hurry, do you do better to ask for, if you want to warm things up in a hurry, do you better to ask for a higher temperature, or do you do better to ask for just the temperature that you want? And a lot of people will behave, a lot of really capable people will behave. They'll set things higher than they want with this idea that it's going to happen faster because it's higher. But the fact is that most thermostat-oriented systems apply heat at a constant rate, and they have a feedback loop whereby if you have reached the target temperature, well, then they turn off the heat source. And so they're going to get hotter at a constant rate until they reach the target. So if that's your mental model, then you're going to set it to the target temperature. But if you have a mistaken one, then you might set it higher than the target temperature with the mistaken idea that it's going to happen faster. And with ovens and with ovens that have a thermostat and with houses that have a thermostat, this is just untrue. So why do people have the wrong idea about thermostats? Well, they think that there is a variable valve, right? So they think that the amount of heat that's supplied is variable, not constant, and that if you set it higher, it will apply more heat. Now, it's entirely open to question whether applying more heat in terms of warming up your house or warming up your food would be a good idea. I mean, there could be some aspects of that that are good or bad, okay? But the fact is that the general valve theory that they have doesn't actually work that way on things that have thermostats, okay? So you can get users who just get a wrong kind of a mental model. You get people who, when they want to get the elevator at in the building where I work at UWM, they will hit both buttons, both the direction that they want to go and the other direction. Now, you would think that they have the wrong mental model, but sometimes the elevators are so broken that you're lucky to get one at all. And the idea is to just get on one and get a space and then take your lumps as to how fast you're going to get to the floor that you're going to go. So what's funny is that some people who push both buttons have a more complex and robust mental model of the elevator system in the Northwest Quad than people who have the typical one, the one that would be appropriate for a properly working elevator system. That's a little cynical, but I'm going to stick with it. I'm not going to talk anymore about the oven because I think we've done it. There's an exercise here about how an ATM works. And I'm not going to talk through this one either because it was in the text, and I'm hoping that you did some thinking about that. If we were a group of people together, maybe we would talk it through in a group. So I'm going to leave that for you. So the point about the mental model is, how does the mental model that your user acquires, how does it compare with the conceptual model of the system? If they match, then you're probably going to get some very good behavior. If there's a mismatch, you're probably going to be in trouble. Now here's a part of the chapter that I really like because it's one of these kind of observations that you kind of know but you don't know. Okay, we're talking about these gulfs of execution and evaluation, and there's a diagram that goes with it here. So we have a physical system. And we've got goals. Okay, so the physical system would be our system, and the goals would be our user. Okay, that has the goals. So the point here that I think is really important is that information has to round trip. Okay, so the user has to perceive the physical system. And that's this evaluation bridge that's in the foreground. Okay, so they look at the interface display, and then there's interpretation and evaluation, and then they compare that to their goals, and then they turn around and they have intentions, and then you go across the other bridge, the execution bridge. So they have intentions, they turn that into an action specification, they use the interface mechanism, and then they send off the instructions to the system. And we're saying it's a physical system, but in our case it's pretty typically an electronic system. I mean, there's always some kind of a physical device that we interact with. But there's double opportunity for this to break down. Okay? So this can break down in the user coming to understand your system, or the user coming to understand how to affect your system. Okay? And so in the difficulty here, you have to think about the total round trip. Okay? So the evaluation bridge is the gulf of evaluation, and the execution bridge is the gulf of execution. And of course, to get the entire job done, you have to bridge both gulfs. Okay? So bridging the gulfs can reduce cognitive effort required to perform both tasks. And largely, I would say that the observation that I offered a slide or two ago is what I find the most helpful here. It's that to the extent at which you can help the user develop a mental model that corresponds well to the conceptual model of your system, you're going to make those gaps as narrow as possible and as easy to bridge. Here's a human information processing model that's been around for a while. This is from Barber in 1998. And it's a model that conceptualizes human performance in metaphorical terms of information processing stages. Is this the way things go on in our brain chemically? Who knows? To a certain extent, who cares? This kind of a model is a way for us to think about what goes on in information processing in our brains that is helpful to interaction designers. Really? Okay? So we can think of 4 stages: encoding, comparison, response selection, response execution. 4 stages. There is a model human processor, research by Card and Company, 1983. It models the information processes of a user interacting with a computer. It predicts which cognitive processes are involved when a user interacts with the computer. It enables calculations to be made of how long a user will take to carry out a task. Now that's pretty interesting because, yeah, this is a model and it's based upon a theory. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with rules of thumb that could help the interaction designer. And the one thing I like about the human processor model is just the graphics. Okay, this illustration that we see here is just so appealing to me. It's kind of line art from the 1930s or 40s, and it's, although this is a more contemporary model, it's just really appealing. Okay, so we see how all these things go. All right. So the leg bone's connected to the whatever bone. All right. And the idea here isn't that we know on some kind of molecular or electrical kind of a level that this is how things happen. The fact is that we find this model helpful at making estimations of how long things will take. So one of the problems is that these kind of models are they were developed in a lab. Okay, so they lead to findings that are most useful in a lab, but sometimes they're not going to adequately account for how people really interact with computers in the real world. Okay, so if we go back and we see this person interacting with the computer in the lab, well, that's all very controlled. Compare that with me trying to work my my smartphone at the Women's March on Washington where people are crushing me. I can barely get the phone out of my pocket. I'm afraid I'm going to drop it. I'm being pushed from left to right. And I'm not getting the best service from the carrier because there are, instead of the expected 200,000 people, we have 500,000 people. Well, maybe that model's not going to predict how long it's going to take me to do something in those circumstances. Okay, so some of our real world circumstances are much more demanding than those lab circumstances. Now, we have a couple of models of cognition that are kind of helpful in thinking about our users and what's going on. Okay, and one of the models that is helpful and I think pretty well described in the text is this distributed cognition. So it's concerned with the nature of cognitive phenomena across individuals, artifacts, and internal and external representations. It's described in terms of the propagation across representational states, and the information is transformed through different media, computer displays, papers, heads. Okay, so do we have the, yeah, we do. Okay, so here on slide 55, we have a really cool illustration, and we're talking about, if we look on the left side under number 1, the traditional model, it's all pretty simple. Okay, so we have inputs. We have a single perceiver and actor. Okay, and they have sensory input. There are processes that go on. Perhaps it's helpful to think of them in terms of that processor model that we saw a couple of slides ago. And it's going to turn into outputs in terms of that individual's motor behavior. They're going to click a button. They're going to type. They're going to speak. Right? They're going to do something. Okay. On the right, in the distributed model, we've got a much more complex thing going on. Okay? And the talk in the text that I really like is about a flight crew that's flying a plane in collaboration with a controller who's on the ground, an air traffic controller. And so, number one, there's not just one actor. Okay? Number two, the actors are collaborating in order to come up with a successful outcome. Number three, there are systems and artifacts that are helping them get the job done. There are air traffic control systems for the controller. There are radar and avionics in the plane. There are memory aids. There are radios for voice communication. It's a pretty complex distributed kind of a model. Probably harder to predict how long something's going to take. You probably have to go out and do some research about how long things actually take. Than in the more simplified model that we saw a couple of slides ago. Okay, but the good thing about the distributed model is it can accommodate some of these very complex phenomena like safe air travel that are very important to us and to our society. So here's a cool picture on slide 56. We have propagation of representational states. So one, air traffic control gives clearance to pilot to fly to higher altitude. That's verbal. 2, the pilot changes the altitude meter, it's mental and physical. 3, the captain observes the pilot, visual. 4, the captain flies to a higher altitude, mental and physical. Now, for those of you who are commercial pilots, this might be a simplification that you're not willing to agree to, but you can get some kind of idea about how complex this interaction is, and how the information is really propagating through the system. So what's involved? There's distributed problem solving that takes place. There's both verbal and nonverbal behavior. There are various coordinating mechanisms that are used. We've got rules and procedures. We've got some things in terms of the avionics of the plane. Just the plane is only going to accept the avionics systems for the planes are only going to accept certain inputs from the pilots. Certain other inputs are going to be ignored. The communication that takes place as the collaborative activity progresses, how knowledge is shared and accessed. So, I mean, it's a pretty complex view of the world for a very complex and important problem. Now, we have another category here that I think is pretty important, because this is something that we try to take advantage of with our information system solutions all the time. Okay, so this is a place where we get called upon to design and to act. External cognition is concerned with explaining how we interact with external representations of information, maps, notes, diagrams, etc. We need to know what the cognitive benefits are of this externalizing, and what the processes are that are involved. How do they extend our cognition, and what computer-based representations can we develop to help even more? This is pretty much on the edge of where we as interaction designers have an opportunity to help, society, I would think. Okay, one of the things that can go on is this idea that the actors can externalize to reduce memory load. So they can use diaries, reminders, calendars, etc. They're written to remind us what to do. We can use Post-its, piles, flagged emails, where it's going to indicate some kind of a priority or some kind of a synchronization of what to do. External representations remind us that we need to do something. They remind us of what to do. They remind us of when to do it. So they're pretty darn powerful. Another thing that we can do, and we do it quite often, is computational offloading. So this is when a tool is used in conjunction with an external representation to carry out a computation. It could be a pen and paper, it could be a calculator, it could be an app that runs on your smartphone or on your laptop. And they say, try doing these two sums below. And they've got one is in base 10 with Arabic numerals, and the other one is, I guess, in base 10 as well with Roman numerals. And which is the easiest and why? And, because we read the Arabic numerals more quickly, it's the former rather than the latter. I just want to point out that it would be possible to create a calculator, although we don't get a lot of Roman numeral calculators. Um, this is a kind of task I love to give to programmers who are trying to learn uh, how to write a little interactive screen-based dialogue. Okay, calculators are great ways to do it, and why do calculators have to work on the Arabic numeral system? It's entirely possible to write a little calendar app that works on Roman numerals that could do, that could work just like you see. I mean, take that calculator app that comes up on your it's part of the accessories on your laptop, and you click on 2, then 3, then 4, and then the X for times, then 4, then 5, then 6, and then the equal. Well, what's to keep you from creating one which you can click on a C, an X, an X, an X, an I, an I, an I, an I, and then, well, nothing to keep you from doing that. Now, probably this is going to display it in Roman numerals, and perhaps that's going to be inconvenient for us to read yet again. But there's nothing to keep us from taking that kind of a computational work, which is fairly hard for us to do, and offloading it to a computing device. Okay, a couple of other things that we use are called annotation and cognitive tracing. Annotation involves modifying existing representation through making marks, crossing off, ticking, underlining. With people in information science sometimes talk about marginalia, where people will make make entries in the margins. The idea is we're taking some kind of a work, and we are making it hopefully more valuable by marking it up. Cognitive tracing involves externally manipulating items into different orders or structures. So the classic examples of these are putting your Scrabble letters in order on your little tray that holds them, or sorting your playing cards into order so that you can better understand the value of the cards in your hand, or what your strategy or tactics might be for your next couple of plays. So, again, we're interaction designers. What's the design application? Well, we want to provide external representations at the interface that reduce memory load and facilitate computational offloading. So we want to use information visualizations that have been designed to allow people to make sense and rapid decisions about masses of data. Okay, so there are all kinds of things that we can do in our user interface to make it easier to remember the data we have at hand. Okay, we can make it easy to visualize them. For instance, a hand of cards, we might want to sort into the order that people might traditionally sort them into. The other thing is that we have the possibilities in these kinds of user interfaces for personalization, right? So certain card players might sort their hands in certain orders, and certain other card players, perhaps there might be a difference between, say, beginners or intermediates or experts. Okay, so some of these kinds of features might not be straight kind of understanding the cognitive aspects of people, but a combination of those and the preferences of people based upon their level of experience. Okay, so we've come to the bitter end. A little bit of summary stuff. Cognition involves several processes, including attention, memory, perception, and learning. The way an interface is designed can greatly affect how well users can perceive, attend, learn, and remember how to do their tasks. Theoretical frameworks such as mental models and external cognition provide ways of understanding how and why people interact with products. This can lead to thinking about how to design better products. So, again, in our course, the approach that we're taking is more thoughtful and scientific than simply tips and tricks. And in particular, within this chapter, we've gone through a lot of theories and models that have implications for design. And our feeling here is that they're going to be more long-lived than tips and tricks, because the devices that we have are going to change over time. The style of computing that we have is going to change over time. And yet, people's cognitive abilities are going to be more stable than that. It's probably true that the researchers and the theorists who we got this stuff from, that's not going to be static either. I mean, people are going to continue to take the work that we've learned about here within the chapter, and they're going to extend it. They're going to stand on the shoulders of giants, and they're going to create new knowledge. So that's the reason why we would want to keep in touch with things that are happening in this whole human-computer interaction and interaction design field. But the thought is here that these more general principles that we're learning within the chapter are going to be more persistent and useful than just a list of tips and tricks that we would get at any particular point in time. Certainly, as I said before, the tips and tricks that I was taught 40 years ago are pretty well useless now. There are some general principles that are still useful, but the individual tips and tricks all had to do with tools of the day, which are not the tools of today. And the tools of today won't be the tools of tomorrow. So that's why we're taking the approach that we're taking. So having given you that to think about, I'm going to say bye until next time. Bye-bye.